In the opening scene, a young black man named Andre walks alone at night down a well-kept suburban street. A small sports car starts following him slowly, making him nervous. Andre decides to change direction and walk back the way he came, but when he looks back, he sees the car hasn't moved, though its door is open. Suddenly, a man wearing an old helmet rushes out, attacks Andre, knocks him out, and drags him into the car. Rose arrives at her photographer boyfriend Chris's apartment with pastries and coffee as they are preparing to leave for the weekend to visit her family. Chris expresses concern that her family doesn't know she's dating a black man. Rose tells Chris not to worry, acknowledging that her family might make silly comments but are open-minded. When Chris asks if he's the first black person she's dated, Rose confirms it, but assures him her parents will be totally fine with it. During the car ride to her parents' home, Chris reaches for a cigarette, but Rose takes it and throws it out the window, knowing her parents wouldn't approve of him being a smoker. Chris calls his friend Rod, a TSA agent, reminding him to take care of his dog and not feed him people's food. Rod disapproves of Chris dating a white woman and jokes about visiting white people being a bad idea. While they deeply engage in conversation and not fully paying attention to the road, a deer suddenly runs in front of their car, causing them to hit it. They pull over to check the damage to the car and then call the police. When the police ask what they're doing in the area, Rose quickly covers for them, saying they're visiting her family nearby. The officer asks for Chris's ID, but Rose intervenes, stating that since he wasn't driving, there's no need for it. The officer lets them go, and Chris appreciates Rose standing up for him against the racist cop. Chris and Rose arrive at her parents' home, where they meet her father, Dean Armitage, a friendly neurosurgeon. Rose's mother, Missy, is an oddly calm hypnotherapist who offers to help Chris quit smoking through hypnosis, but he feels uncomfortable about people messing around in his mind. The Armitages also have two black servants, Walter and Georgina. Dean explains they were hired to take care of his parents, and he would have felt bad letting them go. Chris notices something off about Walter and Georgina, as they both have an artificial Stepford-like demeanor. Dean gives Chris a tour of the house, showing him old family photos and explaining that his father missed out on competing in the 1936 Olympics. Later, they all sit down and chat over drinks. Chris and Rose admit their love for each other, and Dean asks Chris about his parents, learning that his mother died in a hit-and-run accident when he was 11 years old. Georgina has a momentary glitch while pouring a drink, and Missy tells her to go rest. The Armitages then inform Rose that they're hosting a big gathering the next day, surprising her. As Jeremy, Rose's brother, arrives, there's a cheerful and welcoming tone, but underneath, there's a hint of sorrow lingering in the air. At night, in the Armitage dining room, everyone gathers after a meal. The group laughs at Jeremy's stories, but things take a turn when Jeremy, drunk, tells a crude story about Rose's high school crush. When Jeremy becomes aggressive towards Chris, Dean intervenes and tells him to stop. Late at night, Chris and Rose retire to their room, where Rose apologizes for her family's behavior. But around midnight, Chris wakes up and decides to sneak out for a cigarette. Outside, he encounters Walter running towards him, but the man abruptly changes direction and runs off. Meanwhile, Georgina is staring out a window, but it becomes clear she's staring at her own reflection rather than Chris. As Chris starts to head back inside, Missy startles him by turning on a light. She again offers to help him quit smoking and begins subtly hypnotizing him with a teaspoon. Chris opens up about the trauma of his mother's death when he was 11, admitting he was too scared to take action. As present-day Chris becomes more anxious, tears fill his eyes, and he grips the arms of his chair tightly, while his younger self sinks deeper into his bed. Missy continues to tap her teaspoon, coaxing Chris to sink deeper into his memories. Eventually, Chris's consciousness seems to leave his body, leaving him paralyzed in the chair as he witnesses himself and Missy from above. In the morning, Chris wakes up and checks his phone. He sees a picture from Rod pretending to give his dog beer. Since his battery is low, he plugs it in to charge. Chris then tells Rose that he believes her mother hypnotized him the previous night. He has unclear memories of what happened during the night. At the Armitages' big party, a group of older white guests make inappropriate comments to Chris, making assumptions about Chris's strength and sexual performance based on his race. Feeling uncomfortable, Chris sneaks away and meets Jim Hudson, a blind art dealer, who tells him that everyone at the party is oblivious. Jim admires Chris's work and admits to envying his talent. When Chris returns to the party, he encounters another black man around his age who behaves strangely, resembling Andre from the opening scene. Chris tries to bond with him, but feels a sense of familiarity. Feeling uncomfortable, he goes to check on his phone, but it's unplugged and dead. Chris suspects Georgina. Chris's anxiety and Rose's distrust make the situation uncomfortable. Chris calls Rod from Rose's room and tells Rose's mother hypnotized him. Paul warns him about the danger of being exploited by white people and urges him to leave. Paul also advises Chris to take a photo of the black man to see if he remembers him. Georgina, the maid, suddenly appears and apologizes for touching Chris's things and starts an awkward conversation, making Chris feel uncomfortable. Georgina becomes extremely emotional and begins to cry, confessing that the Armitages treat her like part of their family. Chris goes back outside and tries to secretly take a picture of the calm black guy, Andre, with his phone. However, he forgets to turn off the flash. When the flash turns on, the man's mood changes completely. He becomes angry, his nose starts bleeding, and he shouts at Chris to leave while he still can. Rose becomes furious and demands an explanation from her father. Dean explains that the flash from the camera caused the person to have a seizure. The man then comes forward, apologizes for causing a disturbance, and says he needs to leave. Chris and Rose take a walk, and Chris tells her that he's certain he recognized the man, and that something strange is definitely happening. Rose agrees, saying it didn't look like a seizure at all. Chris expresses his desire to go home, and Rose reluctantly agrees. She says she will come up with an excuse to tell her parents. Back at the house, Dean is conducting a silent auction with his guests. They hold up bingo cards to place their bids. Near Dean is a picture of Chris. Jim Hudson wins the auction. As the other guests leave, Chris begins to pack his belongings. He receives a call from Rod, who informs him that the person in the picture is someone they know named Dre, who used to work at a cinema but disappeared some time ago. The phone battery dies, and Chris notices that the closet door is open. He peeks inside and finds a box filled with photos of Rose with many other black people, displayed affectionately. There are also pictures of her with both Walter and Georgina, who don't resemble the robotic versions Chris has encountered. Chris isn't the only black person Rose has been involved with. With everything in mind, Rose returns, and Chris asks for the keys to put their bags in the car. As they start to leave the house, Jeremy suddenly appears, blocking the front door. Dean and Missy are also there. Jeremy is ready to attack, but Missy and Dean tell him to calm down. Chris continues to ask Rose for the keys, but Missy and Dean suggest he shouldn't leave. Chris insists on the keys, and Rose calmly responds, "You know I can't give you the keys." Finally, Chris realizes that Rose is also involved in whatever is happening. Jeremy then attacks Chris. Dean shouts, and Missy clinks the teaspoon on her glass, causing Chris to sink back into the dark void. Meanwhile, Rod keeps trying to call Chris, but it goes straight to voicemail every time. He investigates the picture of the person in the photo and discovers that he disappeared some time ago. So, he decides to go to the police. He tells a female officer that his friend was kidnapped by white people to be a sex slave, just like the missing person in the photo. She brings in 2 more officers to listen to Rod's story, but when he finishes, they burst out laughing. No one takes him seriously. Chris wakes up to find himself tied to a chair in front of a mounted deer head and an old TV set. He watches a video made by Dean's dad, talking about eternity and other strange things. Chris notices that his fingernails have torn through the leather arm of the chair, exposing the padding. Suddenly, the teacup and spoon appear on the screen again, making a ting sound, and Chris passes out. Rod tries Chris's phone again, and Rose answers. She lies, saying Chris left 2 days ago, and she's also worried about where he is. She claims he left in a taxi, or maybe an Uber. Rod tells her he went to the police, and she seems concerned. He starts to realize something's wrong, so he tries to record the call. But when he speaks to her again, she says she knows he wants her. He calls her crazy and hangs up. Chris wakes up to find Jim Hudson on the screen. Jim explains that they're going to swap brains. While others at the party are focused on race, Jim doesn't care about that. What he really wants is to see the world through Chris's eyes. Dean and Jeremy prepare Jim Hudson for a brain transplant. Jeremy goes to fetch Chris, who is found seemingly unconscious nearby. Jeremy removes Chris's restraints and prepares an IV, unaware that Chris was pretending to be unconscious by stuffing padding in his ears. When Dean calls for Jeremy and leaves the lab to look for him, Chris attacks Jeremy, impaling him with deer tusks from the other room. In the chaos, a candle is knocked over, setting the curtains on fire and also igniting Jim Hudson. Rose is unaware of the chaos as she listens to music on tiny headphones, browsing pictures of attractive black men. Meanwhile, Chris confronts Missy upstairs. She reaches for the teacup and spoon, but Chris smashes the cup first. Missy then attacks him with a knife, but Chris overpowers her and kills her. As Chris tries to leave through the front door, Jeremy returns and puts him in a chokehold twice. Chris manages to fight back, injuring Jeremy and escaping outside. He gets into Jeremy's car, where he finds the old helmet from earlier. Chris starts driving down the driveway, but accidentally hits Georgina. Feeling guilty, he puts her in the car and continues driving. Georgina wakes up and tries to grab him, revealing a scar from a brain transplant. They crash into a tree, killing Georgina. Rose, still listening to music, is unaware of what's happening until she hears Georgina's collision with Chris's car. She grabs a rifle and goes after Chris. Chris pleads with her to stop, but she shoots at him, narrowly missing. Suddenly, Walter runs past Rose, chasing Chris. Rose calls him Grandpa as he tackles Chris. They struggle, and Chris manages to take a photo of Walter with a flashlight, causing him to momentarily pause. Walter then asks Rose for the rifle, and she gives it to him. He shoots her in the stomach before shooting himself. Rose is on the ground, bleeding out, trying to reach for the rifle. Chris prevents her from getting it and starts to choke her but stops, unable to go through with it. A police car arrives, but it's Rod getting out. Chris gets into the car. Rose smiles faintly as she takes her last breath. The movie ends as Rod and Chris leave the scene. And with that, the movie ends. We hope you enjoyed our video. Watch the next recaps on the screen, and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing recaps. See you in the next one.